The Chanca people were a late intermediate ethnic group in Peru, enemies of the Incas. They were centered primarily in Andahuaylas, located in the modern-day region of Apurimac. The Chancas were divided into three groups: the Hanan Chancas, or the Upper Chancas, the Uran Chancas, or the Lower Chancas, and the Vilcar, or Hancahuelos. The Hanan Chancas had their center at Andahuaylas, the Uran Chancas at Uranmarca, and the Vilcar at Vilcasuamin. The Chancas encompassed two ethnic groups with well-marked characteristics: the Hanan Chancas, and the Uran Chancas, who surrendered voluntarily to the Quechua Cusc, and were not destroyed or subjected to forced land transfers. The Hanan Chanca did not leave major contributions other than villages and found remains of Wari pottery and their own rudimentary tools. This area needs better study. The Hanan Chancas were an ethnic group that inhabited the region in the departments of Ayacucho, Huancavelica, Junín and part of Apurimac in Peru. They are said to have originated from the lake named Chuclucha and united the colonial Choclopus and Urquica, both in the Huancavelica department. Their initial territory was located between the rivers Ancoyaco, Pampas and Pachachaca, Taxapurimac. It expanded to the area Ancoyaco y Lucuna, with its headquarters in Porcar and the Uran Chancas of Andahuaylas as a secondary base. They developed an autonomous culture and had an optional language of Puquina. Its capital was Huaymancapa, on the shore of Lake Anari, 35 kilometers of Andahuaylas, on the banks of the river Pampas. The leader who began the expansion of Chancas was called Vilcar, and his mummy was preserved with veneration in Huaymancapa until the time of the Incas. Source: according to various myths, its founders were Vilcar and Vilcar. The error incurred until now was that the ethnic grouping of Hanan Chanca was confused with the Uran Chanca and that the latter joined the pack or Pocaras in a non-existent entity called the Confederation Pocrachanquish. History: for some archaeologists, the Chanca society is a step backwards from the point of view of urban progression, as compared with the Wari culture. Their settlement pattern was the most widespread of small villages. Other scholars believe, however, that the Chancas had large populations. The burials are of two types, some in mausoleums, and others simply on the ground. There are also burials made in caves or rock shelters. They were not rivals of the Incas because they submitted peacefully to the Quechua of Cusco, losing their influence to their older brothers, the Pacos or Hanan Chancas. The towns of Soras and Rucanas were valiant and clearly warriors. They were characterized as farmers. Their god was the feline deity. They painted their faces and screamed when fighting, and they carried the mummy of their grandparents on their shoulders. The Chancas remained cohesive and managed to develop a major regional lordship which reached its height in the 13th century. The Chancas in combat. According to Inca sources that told of the Chanca culture, the Hanan Chancas were bloody in battle. When they captured their enemies, they made them prisoners of war. They gave cruel punishments to show the enemy that they should not be messed with, such as scalping, or skinning prisoners alive. These prisoners were hung upside down so the blood concentrated in the upper body as they made small cuts on the front of the toes. And from there they began to tear the skin gradually, while the prisoner was screaming and terrified. Another common way for them to intimidate their enemies was to make cups from the skulls of prisoners, from which they drank the blood of the enemy. Apogee. The height of the Chanca's expansion occurred between the years 1200 and 1438. After 1430 the Chanca nation attacked the Inca Empire in Cusco. Prince Yupanqui, who had previously been sent to a llama ranch, defeated the Chanca. After the war, the Sapa Inca assumed the name Pachacuta after the tough battle, in which the city of Cusco ran the risk of being captured by the people of Apurimac. According to some Inca traditions, the Uran Chancas had been conquered much earlier, around the year 1230, when the Sapa Inca Mata Capac and his army crossed the Apurimac River, formerly called Capac Mayu, by means of a huge hanging bridge. The Inca, Garcilaso de la Vega, gives Yapanqui a similar feat 100 years later. However, the most solidly researched version establishes his defeat and subsequent submission at the hands of the army commanded by the Inca, Pachacuta, Cusco. It was in 1438 that the alleged leader Hanan Chanca, Anccuhualic, mythified himself so that the people, or the Alis of Ancoyaco, gathered 40,000 warriors from war and launched the conquest of Cusco. He advanced victoriously to encircle the city. While able to gather allies, he offered peace to the besieged, but they rejected the offer. A bloody battle was fought in Huajuapampa, providentially won by Cusco by the timely arrival of friendly forces. This difficult victory became a legend in the story collected by the Indian chronicler, Joan de Santa Cruz Pachacuta Yampasal Camagua. He states that the battle would have been lost if the stone soldiers had not been brought miraculously to life. Stones were dressed as soldiers to fool the Chancas. According to the victors, 22,000 Chancas and 8,000 Cusqueños died at Huajuapampa. Anccuhualic was injured and captured. The Hanan Chancas were chased as far as Antahuala. The leader who defended Cusco took up sovereign power and founded a new dynasty. According to the Comentarios Reales de los Incas by Garcilaso de la Vega, the Inca fugitive was the old Huahuaquic, and the prince that took up the defense of Cusco was his son, Hatchin, afterwards called Viracocha Inca. According to Juan de Betanzos, the fugitive was the old Viracocha, and not only him but his successor, Inca Urco, escaped responsibility, the Prince Yapanqui being their savior. According to the victors, the Inca was the elder fugitive Huahuaquic, and the prince who assumed the defense of Cusco was his son Hatchin, named after Viracocha Inca. This is the most accepted version, which coincides with the chronicle of Miguel Cabello de Balboa and the most refined chronologies. Other chroniclers, among them Bernabe Cobo, mention a second attack by the Chancas shortly after, also headed by Anccuhualic against Pachacatec. The imprisoned leader not only managed to escape, but gathered 8,000 Chanca fighters in Chalcamarca and Insaramaca and resumed the war, this time to regain the lost territories. Being inferior in force, he chose to escape to the jungle, to a region of large ponds or lakes, following the course of the Urubamba River. Organization: Chanca and Andahuaylas were close relatives of the other tribes that inhabited the province of Ayacucho, and as a nation were strengthened after the decline of the Warri expansion. According to Sarmiento de Gamboa, the Chanca territory was divided into three groups, known as Hanan Chanca, Uran Chanca and Vilcar or Rucanas. The Chanca nation was composed of tribes Ancoyaco, Andahuaylas, and Rucanas and Soras. Regarding the geographic relationship of the native Indians, the Rucanas were divided into three groups: Hanan Rucana, Huron Rucana and Andamaka Rucana. According to anthropologist Victor Navarro del Aguilar, Rucana comes from Rucac or Lucac, i.e., shippers or mule drivers. The title was given to this province during the times of the Inca Empire precisely because they were carriers for the royalty, wearing a distinctive white and red on the head. The third important province of the Chancas was that of the Soras, whose ancient language was Aymara. The Soras were divided into three groups: Hanan Soras, Huron Soras and Chalco. They held a snowy mountain called Cahuache in great reverence and were never defeated by the Chancas, being at constant war with them and allied with the Incas. Economy: the economy of the Uran Chancash was based primarily on agricultural crops and animals. They grew various Andean cultivated plants, in different ecological zones, and what amounted to the raising and shepherding of llamas, vicuna, alpacas and guanacos, in herds of appreciable size, which were administered from towns with special provisions to control them and feed them while they provided wool and meat. Culture and ceramics: generally the ceramics were flat with a rough surface and sometimes with a red diluted slip. The decoration was a relief, with the application of buttons or clay figurines, supplemented with incisions or circular stamps. The shapes were open dishes and jugs with narrow necks, that sometimes show rustic faces. The land where the Chanca culture was located was a strategic place from where they dominated the territory and could easily develop defensive actions. The location was related to nearby water sources, and they could take advantage of the resources offered by the land, and the presence of several ecological zones in which they were able to use to cultivate plants and rear animals. Damien de la Bandera said about them, "They all live between the highest and the lowest points in ground cooler than hot, in high places and valleys caused by the rains, where they enjoy both extremes of the colder land, to graze the domestic cattle, those that have them, and hunt the wild ones, and of the hotter land, to sow seeds at their time. The villages are no bigger than the water and land will allow, and in many of them no more than 10 more Indians could live for lack of water and ground." The same Damien tells us that among these people there were 3 major trades: potters, silversmiths or metalworkers, and carpenters. These trades endured until colonial times. Their most impressive remains are Inca Rakai, studied by Martha Anders, on the banks of the river Mantero north of Huanta, where the Yuran Chancas built the outstanding Sunta fort, the metalworking center of Curumba, and the Intihuatana in Uranmaka, strategically located in the most beautiful parts of the Andahuaylas province. In every district there is also a large variety of remains which demonstrate the legacy of the Waripak or Chanca and Inca cultures. Although there is information about their military history and warlords, the archaeological remains identified as Chancas do not allow an exact profile of the life and customs of these people. Wayman Kappa, as well as Karawasia and Rumawasia, still require further investigation.